Yeah, so my name's Rob Gibson and I grew up in Sherwood in Nottingham.
And what decade was that? When is it your memories?
I was born in 54, so my memories will all be between, I guess, 1960 and, or that may be a bit earlier, 58 and 68.
Right, great. And so, what are your strongest memories of playing as a child? What sort of things did you get up to?
Well, everything was pretty much simpler. So I lived near the park.
Right.
So there was obviously trips to the park for swings. The railway banks were out of bounds, but we used to climb trees on the railway banks.
So is this the park in is this
Woodthorpe Park? Yeah.
Woodthorpe Park, yeah.
And there was a pitch and putt golf course, but that was obviously more for grown-ups. And it was a playground in the snow with sledges. It was a playground in the summer, just running around, whether it was kicking a ball or I don't know, just generally running.
Yeah, a lot of running.
Yeah. Well, I suppose as well we had so it was sledges in the winter, but in those days there weren't even any go-karts. They were called soapbox carts.
Right.
And they were knocked up by your dad or whatever with some old pram wheels and some wood from somewhere. So they had no brakes. They had a piece of rope to steer them. There were soapbox derbies on the forest at the time. So,
okay.
you know, if you had a good soapbox, maybe you got entered into the soapbox derby on the forest recreation ground.
Right, and so that they were organised races then?
Yeah.
Right,
absolutely.
Do you know who did those?
I can't remember. Well, I wouldn't have known at the time.
Sure.
I would have just known that they were taking place.
And that was on the forest, down the hill on the forest.
That was like going down the bit that traverses the forest from Mansfield Road to Knoll Street.
Brilliant. And who did you do that with? I don't know if you.
I only went to see it. I didn't take part in any of those,
right,
but
okay.
I did have a cart.
Right, that your dad made.
Yeah, that Dad made.
Right.
And you learnt to ride your bike on Woodthorpe Park as well, because where there was grass, because obviously if you fell off, you were less likely to hurt yourself. So
yeah.
You know, there was riding bikes. There was.
Brilliant. And who were you playing with then? Was this alongside other people?
Well, this would have been
family or friends?
This would have been friends from the street.
Right.
They were quite typically the kids you went to school with as well.
Okay.
You know, certainly primary school.
Yeah.
Because we didn't get split up until the 11 plus.
Right. And what primary school was that?
I went to Hayden Road Primary School. I guess I would have been taken to the park by my parents and my grandparents from the age of sort of maybe even as low as 3 to 8 or 9. By the time I was 10, I was probably allowed to go up there on my own.
Right.
By the time I was 11, I'd be coming home late.
Okay. So tell me about
when it was dark.
Tell me about those. Tell me about those things then. When you were able to go out on your own, can you remember how that felt?
Well, yeah, independence was. Independence is the greatest adventure, isn't it? So, you know, when you have a bike,
yeah,
and you can go somewhere on your own without having to be taken there by your parents.
Yeah.
That normally came about at the time when you were going to big school.
Right.
You know, because you'd have to find your own way to big school, so you'd be allowed that sort of opportunity to go out on your own with your mates or whatever, instead of having an adult with you.
Right, so that was sort of around the age of 11.
Yeah, so about 11.
More independence.
11, 12, 13, just pre-teens, then there'd be a lot of sort of hanging out on the park. Parks could be, I don't know, sort of places for the imagination to run wild, but in my day, there were like rockers who used to go up the park at night.
Okay.
You know, with their girlfriends and
yeah,
stuff like that. But so it had that sort of fairground type edge to it.
Right.
You know, it was.
So these older people, like
they'd be
teenagers,
teens.
Yeah,
teens
so
would be
older
there,
than you were at that time. Then.
Absolutely, and of course you were dying to be a teen. And then when you go into your teens, you were dying to be 18, so you could, or you were dying to get into a pub so you could be a man.
Yes. Yeah.
But as I say, Woodthorpe Park still had the railway lines from the old Victoria railway station.
Okay.
It had a closed down tunnel. If you followed the railway lines, you got to the quarter-mile tunnel.
Right. Okay.
So-
So did you go? Did you?
Oh yeah,
explore
you
the
had to.
tunnel?
Well, that was a rite of passage, you
Right.
know. So you'd go through the tunnels. You'd tightrope walk on the, you know, across the tops of the tunnels.
Wow.
Well, pretty much, you know, it was like tightrope walking.
Yeah.
Climbing the trees that hung over the railway banks. You
So
know.
is that the tunnel that's got the train in it now that goes under Woodthorpe Road? Is that the tunnel? Or are you talking about the one at? I know there's one at the back of the care home, isn't there, as well?
I don't know.
This side, was it?
Well, the tunnel from Woodthorpe Park, I believe that was closed off some years ago. I mean, it used to go through to the back of Arnold Park,
Okay.
so Arnott Hill Park.
Yeah.
So, but that was, you know, when you didn't quite get halfway through that, it got very dark, and it was like, you know, that was the moment when you either turned back or carried on. So.
And do you remember playing any particular games in there, or was it more exploring?
Um,
or what,
there was
what
a-
sort of thing did you do?
I suppose in that era, then there was a transitional stage between being taken to parks or taken out somewhere by your parents and being able to go on your own. And that transitional period was normally the Cubs or the Scouts or the Boys Brigade or the Army Cadets or the Boys or something like that.
And did you go to any of those?
So I went to the Cubs.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
That's where you learnt how to smoke and drink cider.
Okay, yeah.
But so when you were in the Cubs, you were considered to be educated in the use of rope, so you learnt how to tie knots.
Yeah.
You'd be taught a bit of woodcraft, be taught how to track animals that you'd never even see. You'd be taught to recognise birds. You'd be taught to sew. You'd be taught first aid, which was obviously the most practical thing.
Yeah.
But if your parents thought you were sensible enough, they probably allowed you to have a knife.
Yeah.
My grandfather and my father and their generations all carried like a penknife.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So you weren't allowed one. It was something sharp. You weren't allowed one until you were, you know, deemed to be sensible enough to have one. You weren't allowed near matches.
Yeah.
You know. So when you were in the Cubs and eventually the Scouts, then obviously campfires and stuff, you were allowed to have matches as well.
So which club group was it you went to?
I went to St Martin's.
And where was
Which
that?
was the church. A lot of stuff revolved around the church. St
Okay.
Martin's was very close to where I lived. It's on the brow of the hill in Sherwood, so St
yeah.
Martin's
I think I know the one.
had the Scouts, the Brownies, it had badminton club, it had youth club. So from the time you were like 13 as well, you know, you'd want to go to the youth club
So you'd be
because
going
there were
down.
girls there.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Scouts was still a one sex thing,
Of course.
but
Yeah.
the youth club
yeah.
was mixed.
Open
And if you went to an
world.
all boys school like I did, then it was a really important part of my teens. There was a certain amount of play in school playgrounds as well.
Yeah. What sort of things do you remember from playtime at school?
Tag and stuff like that. I think they still play that, don't they? These
Yeah, and
kids
did you
these days.
that's something I'm interested in because there's regional variations on that, and in Nottingham now it's all Dobby. But did you call it tag then?
Well, there was tag and there was Dobby off ground. And there was
Okay.
something else called stringy as well,
Okay.
which is when, you know, you caught somebody, then they held your hand, and then the two of you ran around. You caught somebody else, then it became three, and then eventually, you know,
Right.
there'd be less people to catch and more people in this actual string trying to get that last person.
So you,
Yeah.
just to clarify that, so you join together with hands, and then you chase the remaining.
Chase the remaining people who you
until
haven't
you've
yet
got
caught.
everybody
Yeah.
in that big group.
Yeah.
Right, and that was called stringy.
Stringy, yeah. The playground
Yeah.
actually had a building in it, probably a bit like an air raid shelter,
Okay.
which was against where the railings are now.
Yeah.
And you used to run across the front of that wall, and people used to throw tennis balls at you. You know, so I don't recall what it was called.
But it was like
But you'd have to
dodge the bullet, basically.
You'd have to, yeah. It was like dodge the bullet in today's parlance. But and then once you'd run past, I guess a few times, you were allowed to be one throwing a ball.
Right.
So
Right, and that was what you did at playtime at
That was one of the things.
At Hayden.
Yeah,
one of the
Hayden,
things. Yeah.
Television
Yeah.
was a wondrous thing in those days because, I mean, it had literally only come in a couple of decades before.
Sure.
So it was a distraction where you used your imagination more than you do these days. Everything's done for you now with graphics, or it's all like pretty much
it's more
almost real.
Yeah.
Whereas in those days, when Blue Peter first started and stuff like that,
Yeah.
it was all about how to make your own Christmas decorations, or how to make rockets out of fairy liquid bottles and stuff like that. So play in the house and whatever, the imagination, quite a bit of the imagination was sparked off by shows like Blue Peter.
Right. So did you try and do some of those then? Did you make some,
absolutely.
Make
Everybody did.
Make some of the crafts,
Everybody did.
Yeah.
And you collected, because milk bottles had like aluminium tops on, so
Sure.
you collected all them all year round so that you could send them in to buy a guide dog at Christmas. Or something.
Right. Okay.
They always had an appeal at Christmas, but there were shows that copied Blue Peter. There were cartoons, puppet shows. I guess the puppet shows in those days would be the 50s versions of Ninja Turtles and sort of cartoon stuff.
So what sort of things? Because I know some of those, but is that still the time of Muffin the Mule and things?
Yeah, Muffin the Mule and
like
Andy
that,
Pandy, but this was for really small kids.
Yeah.
Wooden tops, but then you had stuff like Four Feather Falls. That was the Andersons that then did stuff like Fireball XL5, because rockets in the space. There were no rockets. It was science fiction.
Yeah.
Nobody put a man into space.
Yeah.
It was science fiction.
Yeah.
So you'd want to build a rocket.
So you're in.
That was a bit of play.
Yeah.
And bonfire night, you wanted to see how high your rocket could go. I mean, obviously, you only had fireworks once a year. Goose Fair only came for 2.5 days a year.
Yeah.
There were things and Christmas and whatever, there were things that you looked forward to because they were much more special.
Yes.
And
Yeah, so tell me about seasonal things then. So you mentioned about bonfire night. Did you do penny for a guy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Penny for that.
So where would you go to collect pennies for your guy then?
In Sherwood.
Right.
Normally, or
down on the high street.
And then if you were, you'd park up outside somebody's shop if you could. My grandfather had the newsagents, so
right.
I guess.
So
I guess he sold that when I was about 6 or 7 or something like that. But we did penny for the guy, and you'd go around. You'd sometimes go around to people's houses and bang on the door. There was no Halloween. There was no Halloween thing. There was no trick or treat. But if you were in the Cubs or the Scouts or the Guides, there was Bob a Job Week. So one week of the year you'd go and knock on people's total strangers' doors and ask them if you could ruin their garden for them or scratch their car or something like that for a shilling or whatever.
And did many people let you do that?
Oh yeah, yeah. And there was always an accolade for the person who got the most money.
Yeah.
But sometimes it was people who just did the jobs who were paid the most. Other times, I would think it unlikely that it was always the kid who did the most work. Always outdoors. We lived more outside,
Yeah.
But you have to bear in mind, I think at probably 7, I was walking half a mile to Hayden Road School on my own, through Sherwood. It wasn't, there wasn't the paranoia. There didn't appear to be the danger that there.
And why do you think that was? You think because obviously there was a lot less cars around then, and a lot of people put it down to cars. But what reasons?
No, I mean the paranoia about children being safe and about
stranger danger.
Stranger danger. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. So.
Yeah.
So, and that, of course, would mean that there'd be less of a stigma about letting your child go onto the park.
Yeah.
If you didn't come home on time, you often I'd get my legs slapped or something like that, So, once again, they'd consider that politically incorrect. There was no naughty step in those days.
Right, yeah.
There was just a bit of a red mark on the back of your thigh. I think we were allowed independence when we were ready for it. you know, a bit
Yeah.
of independence.
Yeah.
A little bit at a time, let out on a leash, you know.
And you think that came from about...
Some of it would be time, chronological, and some of it would be distance. I think it's in most children's nature to be naughty.
Yeah.
Or to be... to tempt it, you know, to be a bit adventurous and hope that they wouldn't get caught doing something wrong, like stealing apples, you know, scrumping.
Okay. So where did you go scrumping?
I didn't, because we had apple trees, pear trees, damson and cherry trees in our garden, so I didn't.
You didn't need to.
But if you were walking down the street next to somebody's garden with apple trees in it, and a policeman was walking towards you, you felt guilty. Well, you have to bear in mind, if you roam 1 mile from your home,
Yeah.
then that's like 3 square miles or 3.5 square miles of territory that all of a sudden you've got to discover. So, you know, if we might have gone all the way to Arnott Hill Park down the railway line,
Yeah.
I might have come up here, which would have been half a mile from our house.
Sure.
So, but there were certain boundaries that you wouldn't cross. You know, you probably wouldn't cross main roads that were strange to you.